Hello everyone, a very good morning and welcome to BYJU'S Exam Prep. Welcome to the daily Hindu news analysis. So let's begin today's discussion by first looking at the articles we are going to cover from the Delhi edition of the Hindu newspaper. I have chosen a total of 8 important articles. 2 articles have to be thoroughly discussed and analyzed as they are very relevant for the mains examination. And we have 6 smaller articles that are relevant for the prelims exam. So let's cover these articles one by one. And if you guys are liking the initiative, why don't you support us by pressing the like button, share these videos with other aspirants, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. So let's begin the discussion of today's The Hindu newspaper by looking at this important column on page number 8. This article is very important for environment and ecology. It is dealing with the topic of community rights versus forest conservation. This could be a very important essay topic as well. Because in forest areas, we have traditional forest dwellers and the forest dwelling communities, which are the indigenous communities residing in the forest areas, that play a key role in forest conservation. These indigenous communities are dependent on the forest resources as well for their livelihood. But at the same time, the government is obligated to restrict human activities and economic activities to conserve the forest land. So quite often, the laws and policies of the government, which are focused on forest conservation, might contradict the interests of the indigenous communities. So in this regard, we have to talk about the Forest Conservation Amendment Act of 2023, which was recently enacted by the Parliament. In fact, that is the context for this column. In the month of July and August, the Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha, they have passed the Forest Conservation Amendment Bill, which has turned into the Amendment Act. This whole column is examining this Amendment Act. The key provisions of the Amendment Act are being discussed in detail, and it brings out the debate between community rights of the indigenous forest dwelling communities and the forest conservation laws in India. Now, if you look at this topic has not received much attention, especially the Amendment Act which was passed by the Parliament. It does have serious implications for forest rights of the indigenous tribal communities, and it also has serious implications for forest conservation in India. Despite its significance, it hasn't attracted much media attention, public attention. That is the reason why the writer of the column is highlighting the concerns raised by the Amendment Act. Even though it has some positive provisions, there are few drawbacks and concerns associated with the Amendment Act which are being highlighted by the writer of this column. See, in India, forest conservation has been dealt with by various laws and policies since the colonial times, beginning from the colonial forest conservation laws of 1800s, coming all the way till the Forest Conservation Act of 1980, and the various other conservation related acts like Wildlife Protection Act, the Environment Protection Act, etc. We have had a series of environment related, forest related legislations. But the column points out that in all these legal and policy frameworks, the indigenous communities have not been prioritized. The tribal communities, their forest dwelling rights, their dependency on forest resources for their livelihood, their role in conserving the forest areas has not been adequately recognized and prioritized in India's forest conservation laws and environmental laws, according to the writer of the column. He says that there has been very little recognition, little to no recognition of the rights of indigenous communities who actually have a very important right as far as forest lands are concerned. See, if you look at forest governance in India, if you look at the subject of forest conservation, it falls under the concurrent list, meaning the central government and as well as the state governments, they both have a shared responsibility with regard to forest conservation in India, because it is listed as a concurrent subject on the concurrent list according to the 7th schedule of the Indian Constitution. The central and state governments, they have the authority to notify forest land, which later comes under the regulatory powers, the regulatory authority and conservation powers of the central and state authorities. So the various laws that we already have, they provide these conservation powers to the central and state governments. They both exercise the right to notify forest lands, and accordingly, they can even declare some areas as protected areas. For example, establishment of wildlife sanctuaries, national parks, etc. can be done. And these notified forest lands, they enjoy a higher degree of protection, where even human activity and economic activities can be regulated by the government. So it's in this context that the legal framework that we have with regard to forest conservation becomes very important. You should know the background as well. Now, before the Amendment Act was introduced in 2023, the Forest Conservation Act of 1980 was the primary law that dealt with forest conservation in India. This had replaced the colonial era forest conservation laws. So under the Forest Conservation Act of 1980, the central and state governments are allowed to regulate the extraction of forest resources by the industries and even the resources that are used by the forest dwelling communities. Since the center and the state have the primary responsibility to protect the forest lands, they not only notify the forest land, but they can also regulate the economic activities and human activities and restrict the extraction, the exploitation of forest resources, not just by the industry, but also by the forest dwelling communities, which are the indigenous tribes that reside in the forests. Now, please understand that indigenous tribal communities, which are forest dwelling communities, they have a very close relationship with their environment. Not just in India, but around the world. These traditional forest dwellers, these indigenous tribal communities, they depend on the forest for their livelihood. They carry out basic agriculture. They even hunt few basic animals for their sustenance. They collect minor forest produce, such as fruits and berries, honey, rubber, right? Whatever natural produce comes from the forest is collected by the tribal communities, which helps in sustaining their livelihood. And in return, tribal communities have immense respect for the environment, the forest, the wildlife, and the biodiversity. That's why in many traditional communities, you find that nature is worshipped. In fact, many tribal communities, they don't follow your mainstream faith and religion. Usually they worship the forest itself, the trees, the plants, the animals, birds, etc. So these communities, which know that their well-being, their livelihood and sustenance is dependent on the forest and the biodiversity, they play a big role in conserving their homeland. They play a big role in protecting the forest and the resources of the forest. So there is this direct relationship that exists, a symbiotic relationship between forests and the traditional forest dwelling communities. But modern day legislation, which is aimed at forest conservation, might hamper this relationship between the communities and the forests. Now, this concern exists in India as well. See, the Forest Conservation Act of 1980, in fact, achieved a remarkable success. If you look at how forest land was converted for non-forestry purposes, which would lead to deforestation, almost 4 million hectares of notified forest land had been diverted towards non-forest consumption from 1950s to 1970s. That is before the Forest Conservation Act was brought out in 1980. In the first 3 decades of India's independence, almost 4 million hectares of forest land had been diverted for agriculture, urbanization, industrialization, leading to large-scale deforestation. But once the act was brought in, from 1980 till date, in the last 40 odd years, just 1 million hectares have been diverted. Just 1 million hectares of forest land has been diverted for non-forestry purposes, thereby reducing the impact of India's development on the forest areas of India. So definitely the law has helped in forest conservation. It has definitely empowered the central and state governments to notify forest lands and restrict and regulate human activities and economic exploitation of the forests, which has helped in protecting the forest cover of India. Along with that, we also have the Forest Policy of 1988, which laid down a target of having at least a third, at least 33% of India's geographical area under forest cover. This is a very ambitious goal that has been set by the Forest Policy of 1988. Now, currently, India is further upgrading these goals, these targets, as part of the Paris commitments to the Climate Change Convention, as part of India's nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement of the Climate Change Convention. India has set a very ambitious goal to promote afforestation in order to create additional carbon sink, to remove excess carbon from the atmosphere in order to tackle global warming and climate change. So we are focused on improving and increasing India's forest cover much beyond the set target of 33% of India's geographical area. But these forest conservation laws and other related environmental laws, including the Wildlife Protection Act of 1972, has directly affected the rights of the indigenous communities. Because see, when tiger reserves are set up, when national parks, wildlife sanctuaries are created, when forest areas are notified, and when governments bring in regulations to restrict human activity and economic exploitation, it directly affects the traditional rights of these forest-dwelling communities. Their right to dwell in the forest, which is their homeland from centuries, gets compromised. Especially in core habitats of tiger reserves and national parks and wildlife sanctuaries. These forest-dwelling communities are often evicted, moved out of the forest areas and settled outside of the forest area. It restricts their traditional rights regarding collection of minor forest produce, regarding their basic cultivation and even hunting, which is often sustainable. Tribal communities are very sustainable in their economic practices. They never overexploit the forest resources, as they know that their well-being is dependent on the health of the forest. That's the reason why I told you that tribal communities worship forests and environment. But these laws often contradict the rights of these communities. So that is why, to secure the rights of the forest-dwelling communities, India enacted a very important law in 2006, the Forest Rights Act, the FRA. It was meant to uphold the rights of the scheduled tribes of India that dwell and reside in forest areas. It was a landmark legislation brought out by the then Manmohan Singh government, the then UPA government, and it accorded a set of community rights to forest-dwelling communities in India. For example, their land rights, their title rights were recognized, which means the forest-dwelling communities could continue to reside in the forest areas and their title rights would also be recognized by the government. Their right to collect minor forest produce was recognized by the law. The right of the tribal communities to collect minor forest produce was recognized, which is critical for their livelihood. And it also recognized the right of these communities to play a role in conservation. Community conservation at the grassroots level is critical in overall conservation efforts. Government alone can't lead the conservation efforts. The local communities, the indigenous communities, right, who have inhabited the forest areas, who have a symbiotic relationship with the forest, they have to play a critical role in providing for decentralized conservation efforts. So these community rights with regard to forest conservation was recognized, where the tribal communities were given a pivotal role to play a direct role in forest conservation. In fact, the Gram Sabhas in the Adivasi areas, they were given the authority they were given the authority to provide approvals for economic activities in the region. If forest land had to be diverted for non-forest purposes, for industrialization and for other government projects, for example, prior approval had to be obtained from the Gram Sabhas in the tribal belts, in the forested areas of India. So such important rights were accorded to the Forest Rights Act of 2006 to strike a balance between forest conservation and the community rights of the indigenous communities. But now, this balance is getting disturbed, according to the writer of the column. Because of the new Amendment Act, changes have been made to the forest conservation laws in India, and according to the writer, this directly affects the community rights of the indigenous communities. See, there is one major issue which we have noticed in the Forest Conservation Act of 1980. This was very clearly brought out in a very important Supreme Court case, which is the Godavarman Tirumalpad case of 1996. In this landmark case of the Supreme Court recognized that the definition of forest cannot be restricted only to notified forests. See, under the previous Forest Conservation Act of 1980, only those areas are considered as forest land and only those areas are protected and conserved under the law which are notified by the central government and the state governments. But the Supreme Court in this landmark case had ruled that you can't restrict forest areas just to those areas which are notified by the government. So the Supreme Court expanded the definition of forest land to even cover other forest areas which are not notified but still fall under the dictionary meaning of a forest. The Supreme Court said in the Godavarman Tirumalpad case of 1996 that forest land which deserves conservation under the Conservation Act of 1980 is not just the notified forest land which is notified by the governments, but also other non-forest areas which fit the textbook definition, the dictionary definition of a forest. So this ruling automatically expanded the coverage of this law. Several non-forest areas, non-notified areas also came under the protection of the law, and this became a controversy because this would hamper industrial development across the country. It would even hamper several government projects. Now that even non-notified forest areas came under the protection of the law because of the Supreme Court's ruling in 1996, it restricted the powers of the center and the states to allow economic activities and economic exploitation in non-forest areas. This directly affected industries, private industries, and even government projects from being taken up in the forest areas, which were not technically notified forest areas under the Forest Conservation Act. The Supreme Court had urged the governments to increase the coverage, but many states have failed to do this, and it's in this context that the recent amendment bill was brought out by the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change. To resolve these issues created by the 1996 Supreme Court judgment, the Forest Conservation Amendment Act has been passed by the Parliament in 2023. Now let us see what changes have happened, what new provisions have been introduced by the new amendment, and how does it raise a concern with regard to the indigenous communities. Now, if you look at the new Amendment Act, the primary aim of the Act is to, of course, promote forest conservation in India, to effectively manage the forest areas, promote afforestation, and eventually tackle climate change and deforestation. That is the stated goal of the Amendment Act. It also specifies the exact methods and provisions related to how forest areas can be used for economic exploitation. Essentially, it contains a provision where forest land can be diverted for non-forest purposes. Even notified forest land and even non-forest areas according to Supreme Court's definition in the 1996 case. All these forest areas can be converted into non-forest land where the government can allow economic activities to drive growth and development of the country. Such provisions also have been included. It provides the government more flexibility to drive the economic exploitation of forest areas and forest resources by removing certain forests from the jurisdiction of the law. Essentially, it counters the 1996 judgment of the Supreme Court. The law, the amendment, has provided for several exemptions for this purpose. See, according to the amendment, the Forest Conservation Act of 1980 will now apply only to those forest areas that are categorized under the 1927 Forest Act under the colonial law, and those forest areas designated on or after 25th October 1980, that is when the law was enacted, the Forest Conservation Act was enacted. Only these forest areas will now be covered following this new amendment. So what does it mean? It means that it will no longer apply. The forest conservation policies will not apply for those areas that have been converted for non-forest use on or after 12th December 1996. That was the day Supreme Court passed the judgment in the landmark case. So whatever non-forest areas which were brought under the conservation of the law through the Supreme Court's intervention is now being upturned by the Amendment Act. So post 1996, the non-forest areas which have been used for economic exploitation, right, they have been exempted entirely through the Amendment Act. And along with that, forest areas within 100 kilometers of the China-Pakistan border, even they are being exempted in order to allow linear projects for security and strategic reasons, which will be carried out by the government of India. To create border infrastructure, to improve military and surveillance infrastructure in the sensitive border areas facing China and Pakistan. This exemption has been provided within 100 kilometers of the boundaries that we have with China and Pakistan. Essentially, to create modern surveillance, security and military facilities in areas up to 10 hectares of land, the armed forces, the government agencies can go ahead without the required approvals, without the restrictions of the law, because this area would be exempted from the protection of the Forest Conservation Act. Linear projects are nothing but projects such as roads, power lines, telecommunication projects, etc. So such projects for strategic and security reasons, for national security, can be taken up by the government without following the restrictions of the law. So forest areas within 100 kilometers of the boundary will not be protected under the law. Similarly, the areas converted for non-forest use after 1996, after the Supreme Court judgment, will also be exempted. So the only forest areas which would be covered would be those notified under the British law in 1927 and those notified after 1980, after the law was brought into effect. So this in a way restricts the conserved or the protected land in India. Along with that, it gives more flexibility to the government to provide for economic activities, to allow for large-scale deforestation, industrial activities, and divert more forest land towards non-forest activities, which directly threatens the indigenous rights of the tribal communities. The government has the flexibility right now because of the new amendment, where it can cite several reasons, like national security, for example, or the need to drive ecotourism, to create more tourist facilities, to drive safari-based tourism for recreational activities, environmental entertainment, right? For all these economic purposes, the government can seek exemptions under the law, and conveniently forest land can be diverted for these non-forest activities, right? It essentially provides for greater economic exploitation, which is crucial for creating livelihood opportunities at the local level. It also gives governments more flexibility to convert forest land for non-forest purposes to drive industrial activity as well. But in this entire process, the concerns, the rights and well-being of the tribal communities has been completely neglected. It has been completely left out in the Amendment Act. That is why the law has faced criticism from tribal activists, tribal communities, and as well as from human rights activists. To understand this further, we need to look at the major concern here. The major concern is that the government is essentially, it's countering the Supreme Court judgment in 1996 in the Godavarman Tirumalpad case. The Supreme Court, which had expanded the definition of forest land, this definition is now being curtailed. It restricts, the judgment restricted the usage of forest land for various non-forest activities. Now this can be done conveniently as these areas are no longer covered under the Conservation Act because of the new amendment. So it allows the government to promote large-scale industrialization which leads to deforestation. In fact, the Forest Conservation Act and this Supreme Court judgment has always been opposed by the big industries in the country. Even private landowners, various factories, industries, and even government institutions which have faced hurdles in executing their projects, they've always opposed the Forest Conservation Act and the judgment of the Supreme Court in 1996. So in a way, the Amendment Act has been designed to favor the industrial class. And there's nothing wrong with that. Of course, the government has to balance the need for environment conservation with the need for driving growth and development. In order to grow the economy, in order to provide for socio-economic welfare, the government has to exploit forest resources, right? But of course, there has to be a balance that we have to strike with environment conservation. Sustainable development essentially should be the focus. So to favor the industry, to simplify the forest laws so that it favors economic activities, right? The government has provided for these flexibilities through the Amendment Act. But however, while the government is addressing the concerns of the industrial class, how does the government fail to look at the concerns of the tribal communities and indigenous communities? That is the question the writer is asking. There's nothing wrong in addressing the concerns of the industrial class, right? Private industries definitely had a genuine concern because the Supreme Court judgment, which widened the definition of forest land, had curtailed industrial activities and industrial expansion. So addressing that is definitely in the interest of the country. It drives growth and development within the parameters of sustainable development. But at the same time, the concerns of indigenous communities should also have been taken into account. And this has not been done, according to the writer. That is why the Amendment Act faced a lot of controversy, even when it was tabled in the Lok Sabha, in the Parliament, a few months ago. It faced a lot of opposition from opposition parties. Even the media, the civil society, tribal activists, tribal communities, they all opposed the new Forest Amendment Act. And that's why the bill was pushed for further review by a joint parliamentary committee. A 31-member JPC was set up by drawing MPs from Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha to carry out a detailed and thorough examination of the bill. But unfortunately, this examination was not done in a thorough manner. The writer is pointing out that out of the 31 MPs, hardly around 6 MPs were from the opposition. Everyone else were from the ruling parties and the coalition parties which support the current ruling party at the center. And there wasn't enough debate. The discussions were hurried, pushed through in the JPC, and even in the parliament when the bill was brought back and tabled again and passed by Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha, sufficient debate did not take place. The writer is criticizing the government here for not allowing enough space in the parliament to discuss the concerns, to address the concerns of the indigenous communities and the tribal communities. So even though the bill was referred to the Joint Parliamentary Committee, it hasn't given the desired results. Now, apart from these changes, the provision for prior consent is being entirely removed through the new Amendment Act. Remember, I told you that under the previous laws, prior consent of the Gram Sabhas was mandatory in the tribal areas. It was mandated by the Forest Rights Act for any kind of economic activity, especially to divert forest land for non-forest activities. Prior approval had to be obtained, prior sanction or prior consent had to be obtained by the Gram Sabhas in the Adivasi areas. Now this is being removed completely. See, even in the previous amendments that were done in 2016 and 2017, the mandatory approval, consent of the Gram Sabhas was provided for. You can find this provision in the Forest Rights Act as well. where Gram Sabhas play a big role in decision making at the grassroots, where the Adivasi communities, they themselves can decide whether to permit the conversion of forest land into non-forest land. In a way, this was protecting the community rights. Now this has been completely removed. This provision for prior consent has been removed through the new Amendment Act. Because the central government and even state governments, they've often seen the Gram Sabhas as anti-development. They've seen that in tribal belts, the Gram Sabhas don't grant approvals for conversion of forest land to non-forest activities. That's obvious because the Adivasi communities would like to protect their indigenous culture and their indigenous livelihood and economic activities. Large-scale deforestation, industrialization will directly hit the traditional life of the tribal and forest-dwelling communities. So this has led the governments to have this preconceived notion about Gram Sabhas that they are anti-development. Now with this amendment, the role of Gram Sabhas has been entirely removed. The writer says this has been done primarily to push the compensatory afforestation initiatives, which is economically very lucrative for the private industry and also for the governments. In India, we have something called the Compensatory Afforestation Fund. I'm sure some of you would have heard about it. According to the compensatory afforestation policy that we have, let's say a private industry is executing a project in a forest area. It is deforesting a certain part of forest land. Let's say 10 hectares of forest land is being deforested for an industrial project. Now, according to the compensatory afforestation scheme which is in place, there is a law as well right now which provides legal backing to this compensatory afforestation initiative. According to this scheme, the extent of forest land which is being cleared for industrial activity should be compensated by the private industry by increasing afforestation in another parcel of land. If 10 hectares of forest land is being destroyed, another 10 or even 20 hectares of forest has to be created by that private industry itself. That private company has to bear the cost. Is that clear? So this was managed by the CAMPA funds, or Compensatory Afforestation Fund Management and Planning Authority was managing this until 2016. Now we have a dedicated law. The Compensatory Afforestation Fund Act was passed in 2016, which provides for the user agency, the private player, could be a mining company or an industry, which is diverting forest land to non-forest purposes, will have an obligation to plant forests for an equal area of non-forest land, and if such land is not available, they have to provide for afforestation of twice that area which they are degrading, which they are deforesting. Right? So this cost will be borne by that private company. Now this had created an opportunity for the government where it could grant approvals for these industrial projects in forest areas as well, and in return they had to just take up some afforestation initiatives. But the problem here is that, the real problem that has existed here is that the Compensatory Afforestation Act does not specify the quality of forest which has to be cultivated through afforestation initiatives. It doesn't really place these obligations on the private industry. Because see, a natural forest is very different in terms of the tree structure, the quality of the trees, the flora, fauna present, the biodiversity that is present, compared to a forested area which is artificially created. The law does not specify anything regarding this. So this had become a lucrative opportunity for the governments and the industry, where in the name of compensatory afforestation, by showing that if deforestation happens because of an industrial project, they are compensating for it through afforestation. So there was no focus here on the quality of the forest which will be created. So just by planting few saplings, few trees in a small area to compensate for the deforestation, these projects would easily go ahead, which was seen as lucrative by the industry and also by the state governments. Now when this concern is already there, if prior consent is also being removed, right, it will only enable the states, the governments to further grant more approvals for diverting forest land for non-forest activities. And eventually, who will suffer? Who will take the hit? It is the indigenous communities. Now, The writer also says that the new Amendment Act, the Forest Conservation Amendment Act of 2023, also affects the Forest Rights Act. It contradicts the Forest Rights Act, which until now was the main guarantor of community rights to the traditional forest dwelling communities. For traditional forest dwellers, community rights were guaranteed primarily through the FRA. As I explained earlier, their title rights, their right to collect minor forest produce, their conservation rights at community level, they were all protected through this law. Now, even these rights are being undermined by the new Amendment Act. The writer says that the governments were anyways not serious about implementing the Forest Rights Act because they saw this as well as an impediment for driving industrial activity and economic exploitation of forest land. So now through the new amendment, FRA is further weakened. The governments have diluted the rights guaranteed under FRA, and through the new Amendment Act, the new Forest Conservation Amendment Act, they can easily divert forest land for non-forest activities, which will increase deforestation and threatens the environment and also threatens the basic rights, the traditional rights of the forest dwelling communities. So these are the various concerns being flagged by the writer. Of course, these are the drawbacks. There are positives as well. The positive is that the long-standing complaint of the industry against the forest laws is being simplified. In a way, it makes it easier to drive industrial growth and economic exploitation of the forests, which is necessary for the growth of the country. If the government has to provide for socio-economic welfare, create jobs, then you have to rely on natural resources, right? But the drawback is that it poses a threat to environment conservation and forest conservation, and as well as to the rights of the forest communities, the traditional indigenous communities. So in conclusion, the writer says that there is a need to examine the law again. There should be wider consultation with all stakeholders before implementing it. See, now the amendment has been passed. It's already become an act. At least in implementation, further care has to be shown by the central and state governments. They need to engage with all the stakeholders and thoroughly evaluate the impact of these changes. Not just the economic impact, but also the social and ecological impact should be considered before implementing the new changes that have happened in the forest conservation laws. So in conclusion, let's say there is a question on this topic, you can suggest that these are the positives, these are the drawbacks and concerns. So the government, before implementation, should carry out a thorough review, should review the long-term impact, the ecological, economic and social impact of the forest conservation laws, and it should consult with the forest dwelling communities, with the Adivasis. It should engage with experts, environmental experts, social activists, and even with NGOs and environmental organizations to ensure that these changes will not affect the community rights of the indigenous tribes. At the same time, the government should also show greater commitment for conserving the forest land while driving industrial growth. This is always a challenge. Growth and conservation, right? They're always inversely proportional. So striking that balance is the challenge for the government, and the only solution here is sustainable, inclusive development. If governments prioritize sustainability and inclusive approach, then the answers can be found. So that is what you can suggest as well as part of the conclusion or the way forward to a question on this particular topic. So this completes my detailed discussion of this important article in today's newspaper. Now let's move on to another important column that is related to internal security under GS paper 3 and also to international relations under GS paper 2. In this column, the writer, who is a former member of the National Security Council Secretariat, provides a very interesting debate on India's approach to counter-terrorism. The writer has formidable experience in the field of national security and counter-terrorism. Right? She has been a former member of the National Security Council Secretariat, which is one of the key policy bodies and think tanks of the National Security Council. So based on her experience, her knowledge, she is providing India's approach towards counter-terrorism. And she draws a comparison here with the approach that Israel is currently following in its approach to counter-terrorism. I know it's a very sensitive, delicate topic, but it's very important to examine what the writer is suggesting. Because there is a lot of merit to what the writer is arguing here. See, as you know, on the 7th of October, Hamas carried out a deadly terror attack. 1,400 innocent Israelis were slaughtered by this Palestinian terror outfit. Following this, Israel has declared war against Hamas. It has not only strengthened the blockade against Gaza Strip, but it has carried out indiscriminate bombing, along with a land invasion of Gaza, where several civilians have been killed. The death count has crossed 10,000, including 4,000 plus children. Right? A massive humanitarian crisis has gripped the Gaza region, triggering calls for a ceasefire. This is where Israel often faces criticism of using disproportionate force, even going to the extent of targeting civilians indiscriminately by citing counter-terrorism as the reason. In the name of counter-terrorism, Israel is known to leverage its military strength and its intelligence capabilities to use massive force against terror groups, and it is ready to pay any collateral damage or collateral cost, including the lives of civilians. So this approach of Israel, which is seen as a more masochistic or a more brutal approach, this is being compared with India's more realistic approach towards counter-terrorism. The writer draws parallels with 26/11 attacks, the Mumbai attacks, the Uri attacks and Pulwama attacks, which have been major acts of terrorism against India. See, she takes these incidents as examples and how India responded during these incidents, and draws a parallel here with Israel's response, and suggests that India's realistic approach is much better, much more efficient in countering terrorism and also in preventing war, tragedy, and the cycle of violence. Please understand that the Mumbai attacks carried out by Lashkar-e-Toiba was India's equivalent of the 9/11 attacks. It was compared with the 9/11 attacks carried out by Al-Qaeda against the United States in 2001. See, India also has been a big victim of state-sponsored terrorism. Pakistan has been constantly sponsoring terror groups against India. Just like Israel being a victim of Palestinian terrorism, India has been a victim of Pakistan-sponsored terrorism. But the approach India-Israel have taken to counter-terrorism is starkly different. Now, after the Mumbai attacks, the then Prime Minister Manmohan Singh adopted a policy of strategic restraint. As you know, in the Mumbai attacks, 10 terrorists from Pakistan belonging to Lashkar-e-Toiba, they infiltrated through the sea route. They went on a rampage in Mumbai for 3 days, killing hundreds of civilians, holding hostages, right? And this became one of the most atrocious attacks that India had experienced. So there was a lot of public anger, media outrage. There was a lot of pressure on the government to retaliate, to take revenge. To take revenge against Pakistan, as clearly India had pinpointed the involvement of Pakistan and its state agencies in planning and sponsoring the Mumbai attacks. Despite this overwhelming evidence and pressure, the Manmohan Singh government withstood the pressure and adopted a very controversial decision to adopt a policy of strategic restraint. The government was criticized for this. It faced a lot of backlash from the public, from the media. It became a political controversy as well, with electoral consequences. But however, if you examine the long-term impact of the policy of strategic restraint, it clearly shows that India gained an upper hand because of the policy of strategic restraint. India has always been very measured, very calculated in its response to countering terrorism, even if it's state-sponsored by Pakistan. Is that clear? Now please understand, showing restraint even in the face of such adversity and tremendous pressure, where people are asking for a reaction, right? Where there is tremendous public and political pressure for immediate revenge and retaliation. Showing restraint is an act of courage, not an act of weakness. That is exactly what the writer is pointing out, and even the same argument has been made by Shiv Shankar Menon, who was the foreign secretary at that point when the Mumbai attacks happened, who later became the National Security Advisor of India and served Prime Minister Manmohan Singh. He writes in his book, Choices, which is a fantastic book for any civil service aspirant as well. He talks about India's foreign policy choices. He specifically talks about the Mumbai attacks and India's policy of strategic restraint. He says that he himself advocated the use of some kind of military action to please the public, to please the political opposition following the Mumbai attacks, to use the military to retaliate in some way or the other against Pakistan. Despite this advice from most officials, the Prime Minister, the then Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, decided to withhold and withstand the pressure and adopted the policy of strategic restraint. He goes on to illustrate how this has benefited India. Just because India didn't do anything visible doesn't mean India didn't do anything at all. This is a wrong conception that many people have. That is the reason why this policy has been criticized. But a careful examination will show that any serious student, right, who thoroughly examines the outcomes and what India did after Mumbai attacks will understand the relevance and importance of this approach. In many ways, this calculated, realistic approach has been continued under the Modi government as well, following Uri attacks and Pulwama attacks. See, even though India did not go to war with Pakistan after Mumbai attacks, we didn't launch any immediate, visible, overt military strikes. There were many other steps that were undertaken by India given the global circumstances. It's very important to keep in mind the global circumstances. Now imagine if India had gone to war after Mumbai attacks, like Israel. If we had declared a full-fledged war on Pakistan, hitting multiple targets in Pakistan, that too indiscriminately, even civilian targets if they were hit, that would have escalated into a full-fledged war. And don't forget, we are nuclear-armed neighbors. It would have led to a nuclear standoff with very serious consequences, along with tremendous international pressure. And the international focus would shift towards another India-Pakistan conflict. Focus would become Kashmir, focus would become India-Pakistan tensions, not the terror attack itself. The world would have forgotten about the Mumbai attacks very quickly if India had gone for a full-scale military strike like Israel has done. Now, why do you think Israel is facing such widespread global criticism? Right? It has lost the opportunity where it could have targeted Hamas in a better way, diplomatically, through covert methods, through economic methods, and through limited military strikes. By using disproportionate force, it has turned the focus on the humanitarian situation which Hamas is exploiting, because Hamas is known to use civilians as human shields. It has managed to turn the narrative. The global narrative has largely turned against Israel, where Israel is being accused of committing war crimes and crimes against humanity. Most of them have forgotten about the brutal terror attacks Hamas carried out because of the massive retaliation Israel has carried out. This is what happens when you seek revenge, when you seek immediate retaliation. Revenge might be satisfactory. It might satisfy your emotional needs. It's only an emotional response. And don't forget, that is exactly what terror groups want. If you look at terrorism, the very definition of terrorism is designed to grab attention, to strike fear, in order to highlight the political message that they are fighting for. That's why terrorists, they carefully choose their targets. They plan these spectacular attacks to grab maximum attention. They go behind strategic targets. They plan these large-scale sophisticated strikes. So they get maximum media, public attention, which brings a lot of pressure on the government, and the goal of terror attacks is to push governments to overreact. When governments overreact, they are basically fulfilling the purpose of the terrorists. You're actually bringing more attention to the issue that they are trying to highlight, and it in a way enables the fear element which a terror attack seeks to highlight. Now, India, by adopting the different path, by being more realistic and more pragmatic, we relied on diplomatic options and covert options and economic options. Because don't forget, in 2008, our relations with the Western countries was transforming. India was getting closer to the United States. Right? The nuclear deal had just been signed. We leveraged this opportunity to get more support from the US, because even Western countries were targeted in the Mumbai attacks. Western nationals in Mumbai were specifically targeted by Lashkar-e-Toiba, where Americans and European citizens were killed. So finally, Western countries turned against Pakistan and sided closely with India. Our counter-terrorism cooperation with US and European countries increased. This brought tremendous diplomatic pressure on Pakistan. Right? Also, this was a very crucial point in global economy. The global economy was facing a recession. any war, full-fledged war with India-Pakistan would have had disastrous economic consequences for India. Today we have managed to escape the economic consequences and we have turned ourselves into a global economy today. Whereas Pakistan has internally collapsed. And also if you examine the context in which the Mumbai attacks happened, right? The Mumbai attacks were designed to trigger a reaction from India because Pakistan was facing an internal challenge. The ISI and the army, which control the terror groups, they were finding it difficult to maintain their hold over the terror outfits because internal divisions had come up within the terror groups in Pakistan and it was turning out to be a big internal challenge for the ISI and the army. So they needed a distraction. And what better than India, right? Mumbai attacks was in a way planned to trigger India to overreact so that it becomes a unifying cause to bring all terror groups together, which increases the hold of the Pakistani deep state over the terrorist organizations. This is something Shiv Shankar Menon talks about in detail in his book Choices, right? So India ensured that Pakistan does not leverage and take advantage of the Mumbai attacks. We ensured the attention does not shift to another India-Pakistan war. If it had turned into a conflict with a nuclear standoff, right, the international community would have brought tremendous pressure on India as well. They would have forgotten about the terror attack, the victims, the civilians, the atrocity Pakistan had carried out. Instead, the attention would have focused entirely on bringing a halt to the conflict, right? Ensuring the war doesn't turn into a nuclear conflict, ensuring that India stands back, right? US and European countries and others would have put tremendous pressure on India, weakening our fight against terrorism. But instead, by showing restraint, India built up the diplomatic efforts. We carefully collected the evidence linking Lashkar-e-Toiba with the ISI. The planners of the attack, the handlers, were directly linked with the attackers, which gave India conclusive evidence to show Pakistani involvement, Pakistani state involvement. This led to diplomatic isolation of Pakistan, right? The funds being given by US and European countries went down after this. We used platforms like United Nations, FATF, to punish Pakistan diplomatically and economically. Pakistan was grey-listed with India's efforts on the Financial Action Task Force, which affected the flow of investments. Several Pakistani terrorists were designated as global terrorists at the UNSC, right? So none of this would be possible if India had sought immediate revenge and immediate retaliation. Now, if you look at the current Modi government as well, it has used a very calculated strategy. After Uri attacks, India carried out surgical strikes, where Indian special forces infiltrated into POK to hit terror launch pads. After the Pulwama attacks, the Balkot airstrikes were carried out by India. These were not indiscriminate attacks, even though the military option was used, because our military capabilities had been built up. We had greater international support as well, and Pakistan had been sidelined. Until the Mumbai attacks, India-Pakistan were equated together by the global community. They would always look at India-Pakistan on the same level. But following India's mature response of strategic restraint after the Mumbai attacks, India's status was elevated. India became a thriving economy, a major partner for all the countries, whereas Pakistan was this country breeding radicalism, extremism, using terrorism as a geopolitical weapon. Now look at where Pakistan is today and where India is today. Right? Pakistan is facing imminent economic collapse. It's dealing with a serious security challenge and a political challenge, whereas India is a stable country with a thriving economy, with great global diplomatic support. Right? Even when the military options were exercised, they were very precise and calculated. India ensured that we de-escalated immediately. After the surgical strikes and airstrikes, a clear message was sent out from India that we are not looking to escalate. We are not looking for a bigger conflict. We didn't mindlessly hit civilian targets. Right? We didn't use disproportionate force. We used very calculated force, imposed a cost on Pakistan to send a message to Pakistan that sponsoring terrorism against India comes with a cost. And after Mumbai attacks, since the Manmohan Singh government, which has continued under the Modi government, India has stepped up its covert operations. Instead of using overt military strikes, which escalates to a war, using your intelligence agencies, running covert operations to hit terror networks, to neutralize terrorists, to hit their financial mobilization, right? That is any day a better response because our counter-terror and intelligence capabilities have improved, right? Our border security has been improved. So this is the measured, realistic, pragmatic approach India has adopted compared to Israel's machoism and the element, of seeking revenge, retaliating against terror attacks using disproportionate brutal force, which has taken the focus entirely away from Hamas and the terror attack. Now it has become a humanitarian crisis, right? So this is the parallel that the writer is drawing. Of course, the situations are, entirely different. But in general, the approach towards counter-terrorism is what the writer is talking about. She says that this is a much better approach. It has given India better results. It's not a coincidence that terror attacks from Pakistan have declined on its own. After 2008, there has not been a single major attack on a civilian target in India. Right? Military sites have been targeted by Pakistan-based terror groups, but civilian targets have largely been spared because there has been tremendous international pressure on Pakistan. Plus, our security has improved. Our intelligence agencies have improved their capabilities. Covert operations have gone up, which has yielded these better results without derailing our economy, derailing our growth, and without affecting our global image. Right? So that is the argument the writer is presenting. She says that a realistic, pragmatic, measured approach to counterterrorism is better. The policy of strategic restraint, the policy of calculated military strikes, along with diplomatic pressure and covert operations, is a much better approach compared to the mindless, disproportionate strikes being carried out by Israel against Hamas. Is that clear? Now, this completes my detailed discussion of all the big articles. Now we head towards the prelim section, where we have few small articles that are important for the prelims exam. So let's take a quick look. On the front page, we have this article related to Indian economy. The article says that retail inflation has reduced to a 4-month low of 4.87% in October. So here there are important concepts you need to understand from a prelims point of view. You should know what is retail inflation, how it is measured in India, right? What is the index that we use, which institutions are involved in measurement of retail inflation. You should also understand the concept of headline inflation and core inflation, right? These are some basic concepts you should be familiar with. Retail inflation is nothing but inflation experienced at the consumer level, at the retail level. As you know, inflation is nothing but price rise, the general rise in prices over a period of time in the goods and services that we are consuming. This inflation can be measured at the wholesale level, also at the retail level. But retail level inflation gives a better picture of the cost being paid by the consumers due to rising prices. So retail inflation is nothing but your consumer level inflation. The price rise being experienced by consumers, not at the wholesale market level. So an index is used to measure retail inflation, which is your CPI, Consumer Price Index. This is more or less a global standard where retail inflation is always measured through the CPI index, the Consumer Price Index. It's basically an index consisting of a basket of goods and services which consumers are purchasing. The prices are tracked compared with prices over a period of time, and accordingly the inflation levels are computed. So in India, there are 4 types of CPI which is calculated. CPI for industrial workers, agricultural laborer, rural laborer. These 3 indices, they measure rural level retail inflation, and CPI for urban non-manual employees, which measures inflation at the urban level. So this gives us CPI rural and CPI urban, because the inflationary circumstances in rural and urban areas they tend to be slightly different. The factors could be different. So the first 3 indices, they are compiled by the Labour Bureau in the Ministry of Labour and Employment. But the 4th one is compiled by the NSO, the National Statistical Office, under the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation. The base year for CPI is 2012, and recently in 2020, the Ministry of Labour Employment has released a new series for CPI industrial workers with base year as 2016. Is that clear? So India measures retail inflation through CPI index. It gives a clear picture about the rise in prices of goods and services at the consumer level, and they're computed through these indices. Now, what exactly is headline inflation and core inflation? Headline inflation is overall inflation. The overall change in prices happening in all the goods and services, which is part of that basket through which retail inflation is being calculated. It includes your basic commodities, including food and fuel as well. It includes food, fuel, and other basic commodities that people are consuming, which are part of the index, which are part of this basket. which is used to compute your retail inflation. So it's the overall inflation in the economy. But however, food and fuel inflation are very volatile. As you know, food prices of cereals, vegetables, fruits, they are very, very volatile. They keep fluctuating day by day and week on week. The prices of dairy products, meat, eggs, they keep fluctuating. Same with fuel, right? Petrol, diesel, etc. The prices keep fluctuating with global fluctuations. So if you look at just headline inflation, it doesn't really give you a correct picture, right? It's a very corrupted picture that you get when you look at headline inflation. So that is why economic experts, they take out the volatile components to get the core inflation. That is, food and fuel are excluded from the basket. When you exclude the food and fuel items from the CPI basket and measure the inflation, that becomes your core inflation in the economy, which gives a much better picture of how the economy is performing, right? So these are some basic concepts you should be familiar with. Next article on page number 10, very important for internal security and polity. The Ministry of Home Affairs, the MHA, which is responsible for internal security, has notified 8 Meitei extremist organizations from Manipur as terrorist organizations by notifying them under the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act. As you know, Manipur has been facing a lot of violence, ethnic violence between Meiteis and the Kukis. Right? Previously, Manipur has been a victim of insurgency. Several Manipur-based insurgent groups, be it Meitei outfits or Kuki outfits and others, they've all been proscribed as terrorist organizations under the UAPA. The UAPA is our primary law against terrorism. It's the primary anti-terror law of India. So Home Ministry has the powers under UAPA to declare any organization in the country as a terrorist organization. Is that clear? So be it Lashkar-e-Toiba or Babar Khalsa International, Khalistan Commando Force, Al-Qaeda, ULFA, NSCN, right? Or any other terrorist organization. They're all proscribed, notified here by the government, by the Home Ministry, under the UAPA, designating them as terrorist organizations. So from Manipur, 8 more Meitei extremist organizations have been added to the list. This includes the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, which has been a notorious terror group since 1960s. Its political wing, the Revolutionary People's Front. Then UNLF, another notorious Meitei terror group, the United National Liberation Front. These two groups have operated from 1960s, PLA and UNLF. So some of their political and armed branches, they have been designated as terrorist organizations along with the PRIPAC, the People's Revolutionary Party of Kanglepak, the CORCOM, Coordination Committee, then the armed wing, the Red Army, the Kanglepak Communist Party, and others. You don't have to remember the names of all these extremist groups, but just know that organizations can be designated as terrorist organizations under UAPA provisions. And who has the authority? It is the Home Ministry. Now I'll give you a small question, a small exercise. Can individuals also be designated as terrorists? Does UAPA does it have a provision to allow individual terrorists also to be designated and proscribed? Yes or no? Please comment that in the comment section below along with the provision which provides for it. If there is a provision, mention that. If there isn't a provision, please mention that as well. I'm telling you that organizations can be designated as terrorist organizations under UAPA. But is there a provision under this law to designate individuals like Hafiz Saeed, Masood Azhar? These are individual terrorists. Do we have a legal provision under UAPA to designate individuals as terrorists as well? Yes or no? And provide the justification as well in the comments. Next, a related topic from Myanmar itself. 1,400 refugees from Myanmar have crossed over into Mizoram and sought asylum in India. As you know, Myanmar is going through a major political crisis, going through a civil war ever since the military junta captured power in 2021. Myanmar's military junta has been targeting the pro-democracy protesters and as well as various insurgent groups and ethnic tribal groups and using massive military force against them. So recently, in the Chin district, which borders Manipur and Mizoram, which is home to the Chin community. By the way, the Chins are related to the Kukis in India, in Manipur. They're also related to Mizos in Mizoram. They're ethnically connected. So the Chins have been targeted. Chins have their own insurgent groups as well in Myanmar, which fights against the military rule. And the military junta has used massive force. It has carried out military strikes, used battle tanks and artillery guns as well. And some of these strikes have landed on Indian territory. One of the shrapnel used in the latest strike has landed on the Indian side in Mizoram. And thousands of refugees have fled to India seeking refuge in Mizoram, in the Champai district. Now, this problem has persisted from 2021. In the last 2 years, we have received more than 20 to 30,000 refugees who have been sheltered in Manipur and Myanmar. So this has become a major challenge for India. Because many of the refugees, the extremist groups that we were discussing, they also have ties with organized crime, including drug trafficking, arms smuggling, etc., which drives terror financing and insurgency as well in Northeast India. So India is deeply concerned about these developments. So you should know that there is an important river that borders Myanmar and Mizoram, which the refugees cross over. So there might be a map-based question. It's the Thieu River. The Thieu River is an important topic according to me. It's a 159-kilometer river, which is a transboundary river. It flows along the India-Myanmar border. It originates in the Mizo Hills of Mizoram, flows down along the international border, and then it joins the Kaladan River, which enters Myanmar. I'm sure all of you would have heard about the Kaladan project, which is a multimodal connectivity project India is pursuing with Myanmar, right? So the Thieu River goes and joins the Kaladan River, on which we are building the Kaladan project. So the refugees from Myanmar who are coming from the Chin district into Manipur and Mizoram, they are crossing this river, the Thieu River. So there could be a map-based geography question as well, asking Thieu River flows between which two countries, right? Or it flows along the India-Myanmar border and touches which state in India? The answer is Mizoram, right? It's along the India-Myanmar border. Next article, a very, very important development in the Indian Ocean. China and Pakistan have started their third edition of their bilateral maritime exercise called the Sea Guardian. Please make a note of this. You can see a satellite image here, which depicts the Karachi port, which is a major naval base for the Pakistani Navy. And you can see multiple naval ships and even a submarine. There are multiple naval ships docked in this open source satellite image which is available, right? And these are all naval ships belonging to the Chinese Navy, the PLA Navy. As part of the Sea Guardian 3, which is a bilateral naval exercise between the Chinese Navy and the Pakistani Navy, which is taking place in the Northern Arabian Sea, these Chinese vessels along with Chinese submarines have entered into the Arabian Sea. So India closely watches these developments. We have seen of late that Chinese naval deployments have increased from Bangladesh to Sri Lanka to Maldives to Pakistan and even to East Africa. China's naval deployments have increased. It has deployed even nuclear-powered submarines, spy vessels, and advanced stealth frigates, supply vessels, and other naval ships have been frequently entering the Indian Ocean, which is seen as a strategic threat by India. So it's very important to keep an eye on the military exercise, the naval exercise between China and Pakistan, through which China is projecting its naval power across the Indian Ocean, right? So this exercise is called the Sea Guardian. This comes at a very crucial time because interestingly, in the same period when the Sea Guardian China-Pakistan exercise is taking place, just before that, Myanmar and Russia held their first ever naval exercise called Marumex in the Andaman Sea. So it's Russia's projection of its military power in the Indian Ocean. Russia, which has been a good friend of Myanmar, has recently projected its naval power into the Indian Ocean right next to India's backyard in the Andaman Sea, where the first ever maritime exercise has been held called Marumex. Now, parallelly, India recently held the 2+2 dialogue with the US. They all happened in the same week. When Russia was conducting the exercise, we had the 2+2 dialogue with US, and parallelly Chinese vessels were entering Arabian Sea to train with Pakistan. Now, as part of the 2+2 dialogue, India has made a big announcement. We have said we are going to become a full-time member of the Combined Maritime Forces led by the US, which is based out of Bahrain. In Bahrain, the 5th Naval Fleet of the US Central Command is headquartered, which is a major naval base of the US in the Persian Gulf. So around 38 countries are part of this group called Combined Maritime Forces, which is a US-led multilateral naval grouping. India had entered this group as an associate partner last year. But now we have said we are ready to join this as a full-time member, which includes Pakistan as well. Pakistani Navy is also part of the Combined Maritime Forces led by the US. It's headquartered in Bahrain. Now Indian Navy will be joining it as a full-time member. So these are very big and major developments happening in the Indian Ocean, and all these points are very relevant for your prelims. Next, on page number 14, we have an article referring to the GEM portal, the Government E-Marketplace portal. According to the article, the buying on the GEM portal has crossed 2 lakh crore rupees. So what is this portal? That is what you should understand, the GEM portal. The Government E-Marketplace portal was launched in 2016 by the Ministry of Commerce and Industry. It is essentially an e-commerce platform where government ministries, departments of the central and state government can procure their goods and services. Just like we order products on Amazon, Flipkart, etc., government ministries, departments are also purchasing a lot of goods and services from the market, right? Various central government ministries, departments, government organizations, PSUs, they all float many tenders, right? They procure from the market. So to simplify this process of public procurement, to bring more transparency, accountability, to tackle corruption in government procurement, this online platform was created. It's an e-governance initiative. So it's an online platform where e-bidding and reverse e-auction can be conducted by various government ministries and departments. And today, all the government ministries, even state governments, have been joining the platform, and all their purchases are happening on this platform, which is very transparent, it's accountable, tackles corruption, provides for fair tendering processes, fair bidding processes, thus saving precious money for the precious exchequer revenue for the government as well. So the transactions have crossed 2 lakh crore rupees, indicating the increasing adoption of the GEM portal, the Government E-Marketplace portal. All right. Now, the last article from Science and Technology, the Euclid Space Telescope is in news in the last page of the Hindu. In the last page of the online edition, the Euclid Space Telescope of the European Space Agency is in news. So the Euclid Space Telescope was launched recently in 2023 by the European Space Agency to make observations. It has been stationed in a halo orbit at Lagrange point L2 around the Sun. Lagrange points are points between Sun and the Earth where the gravitational force of the Sun and the Earth, they neutralize each other, they equate each other. So anything you place in the Lagrange point will remain in that stationary position. It reduces fuel consumption, maintains stability of the spacecraft as well. Our Aditya L1 mission is also headed towards one such Lagrange point. Even the popular James Webb Space Telescope of NASA is stationed at L2. So just like NASA's James Webb Space Telescope mission, which is a major space observatory which is delivering spectacular images of the universe, similarly, the Euclid Space Telescope is a telescope of the European Space Agency that is studying dark energy, dark matter, and the expansion of the universe. In fact, European Space Agency has another space telescope as well called the Gaia, which was launched in 2013. So it's important to be familiar with these major space observatories, be it Euclid, Gaia, which are of European Space Agency, and even the James Webb Space Telescope. All of them are very important. So please understand which agencies it belongs to, which country it belongs to, and also what purpose do they serve. Right? They're mainly observing the universe, the expansion of the universe, studying the Big Bang, studying dark matter, dark energy, which holds answers to the very evolution of the universe and life on Earth. Right? So that is something you should be taking note of. So this concludes my discussion of today's The Hindu Newspaper. I hope it's been a comprehensive, detailed discussion. I hope you guys have liked it. Do let me know in the comments. Now take up these questions for your mains answer writing practice. Alright, so post your answers in the answer writing portal, for which link is provided in the description box below. And also join our Telegram channel, because we have a quiz on all these topics that will help you revise these articles again. The link for the Telegram channel also can be found in the description box of this video. So do let me know how the session went. Do press the like button and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching. We'll see you tomorrow. Have a good day.